At 1 in the morning on the 27th of January, 1972, 4 young Aboriginal men get out of a car on the lawn opposite Parliament House in Canberra. They've just driven down from Redfern in Sydney. Between them, they're carrying a beach umbrella and a handful of placards. They plant the umbrella in the grass, prop up a sign, and call it the Aboriginal Embassy. It is, by any measure, one of the smallest, scrappiest protests in this country's political history. It is also, more than 50 years later, still there. The Aboriginal Tent Embassy is now the longest continuously running site of political protest anywhere in the world. The idea itself wasn't entirely new, even in 1972. Aboriginal activist Charles Dixon later recalled attending a political rally back in 1946, where Jack Patton, co-founder of the Aborigines Progressive Association, had already raised the idea of placing an Aboriginal mission station directly in front of Parliament House, specifically so the world could see, with its own eyes, exactly what conditions Aboriginal people in this country were being forced to live under. It took 26 more years and a fresh provocation from Canberra for that idea to actually take physical form on the lawn. Welcome to Truth Be Told, Stories from Black Australia. This podcast is recorded on Whadjuk Noongar country, and we acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people as the traditional custodians of the land this show is made on. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present. We extend that respect to all the traditional custodians across the lands from where you are listening from, and to all First Nations peoples listening. Today we're talking about the Aboriginal Tent Embassy, how 4 men with a beach umbrella turned into one of the most effective protest movements in Australian history, and why, after 50 years, the embassy is still sitting on that same patch of grass. Quick note before we keep going. This episode discusses ongoing political protest, police confrontations, and an act of arson connected to the site in recent years. Take care of yourself while you listen. If anything in this brings something up for you, 13 Yarn is a crisis line run entirely by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, any hour of the day or night, on 13 92 76. Alright, let's go back to exactly what pushed Michael Anderson, Billy Craigie, Bertie Williams, and Tony Corey to drive 500 kilometres on Australia Day with nothing but a beach umbrella and a plan. By the start of 1972, Aboriginal land rights campaigns across the country had run into wall after wall. In the Northern Territory, the Yolngu people of Yirrkala had taken a mining company and the Commonwealth to court over their own traditional land in what became known as the Gove Land Rights case, after years of trying, unsuccessfully, to resolve the dispute through petitions to the Commonwealth instead. In 1971, Justice Blackburn ruled against them, finding that the relationship between a clan and its country, however deeply held under traditional law, simply didn't amount to legal ownership, as Australian law understood the term, a ruling that wouldn't be properly overturned until the Mabo decision, more than 2 decades later. Around the same time, the Gurindji people, whose story we've already told on this show, were still camped at Daguragu, years into their own fight with Veste brothers over land at Wave Hill, with no resolution in sight. Aboriginal communities across the country were watching both of these disputes closely and drawing much the same conclusion from each of them, that neither the courts nor years of patient petitioning were going to deliver land rights on their own. Then, on the eve of Australia Day 1972, Prime Minister William McMahon made things worse. He announced a new federal policy that explicitly rejected granting Aboriginal communities independent ownership of their traditional land. Instead, Aboriginal people would be offered 50-year general purpose leases, conditional on proving an economic or social use for the land, and excluding any rights to minerals or forestry entirely. For people who'd already spent years watching land rights claims fail in court and stall in Parliament, it landed as confirmation that the system had no real intention of ever giving them anything more than a long-term tenancy on their own country. A group of activists in Redfern decided they'd had enough. Michael Anderson from Walgett, Billy Craigie from Moree, Bertie Williams from Cowra, and Tony Corey from Tweed Heads drove through the night to Canberra. The choice of the word embassy wasn't accidental or casual. As the activists explained it at the time, Aboriginal people had never ceded sovereignty over this continent, had never signed a treaty with the Crown, and were, as a result, the only cultural group connected to this land with no actual embassy representing them in the nation's own capital. Calling it an embassy was a way of saying, bluntly, that Aboriginal people were being treated as foreigners in their own country, and that the absence of any formal Aboriginal representation in Canberra was the whole problem in miniature. What started as one umbrella grew fast. Within days, more tents went up. People travelled in from Queensland, South Australia, and Western Australia to join the original four. Curious staff from the genuine foreign embassies dotted around Canberra started wandering over to ask what exactly was going on. Michael Anderson later recalled the shift in mood from the government side as it became clear the protest wasn't going to simply pack up and leave, an embarrassment that kept growing every time police tried to move it along, and it simply came back, larger than before. On the 6th of February, 1972, the embassy presented a formal list of demands to the federal government, drawn up over a single weekend by the activists camped on the lawn. They called for Aboriginal control of the Northern Territory as a state within the Commonwealth, governed by a parliament that was predominantly Aboriginal, with full title and mining rights to the land within it. They demanded legal title and mining rights over existing Aboriginal reserves across the rest of the country, protection for sacred sites nationwide, legal title to land in and around Australia's capital cities, and compensation in the form of an initial $6 billion payment, plus an ongoing share of national income for land that couldn't practically be returned. Read against the actual scale of what had been taken since 1788, the list wasn't even close to extravagant, though it was reported, at the time, as a wildly radical set of demands by a press largely unused to hearing Aboriginal people articulate exactly what genuine restitution might actually require. 2 days later, Gough Whitlam, then leader of the opposition, visited the embassy in person and spoke to the crowd, a significant gesture from a man who'd go on to become Prime Minister himself within the year. Activists Bobby Sykes and Frank Roberts also addressed the gathering that day, two of the many Aboriginal voices the embassy gave a national platform to that otherwise had very little access to mainstream Australian media at the time. It didn't end there. In May of 1972, the Minister for the Interior, Ralph Hunt, announced new laws making it illegal to camp on unleased land anywhere in the Australian Capital Territory, giving police explicit power to forcibly remove anyone found breaching the new rule, a law clearly aimed at one specific patch of lawn rather than at camping in general. On the 20th of July that year, police moved in to enforce it. What followed was a violent confrontation, officers and protesters grappling directly on the grass in front of Parliament House, watched by media from around the country and broadcast into living rooms that, for many non-Aboriginal Australians, had never previously seen footage of police using force against Aboriginal protesters on their television screens before. 8 protesters were arrested and the tents were torn down. In September, the ACT Supreme Court ruled that the removal had actually been unlawful, since the regulation underpinning it hadn't been properly notified in the way the law required, a procedural technicality that briefly, almost accidentally, vindicated the protesters. The embassy went back up almost immediately. The government's response was to rush through a new bill, making the ordinance explicitly retrospective, closing that exact loophole, and the embassy was evicted again the very next day, the government effectively rewriting the law after the fact, specifically to win a fight it had already lost in court. In October of 1973, with Whitlam now Prime Minister, around 70 Aboriginal protesters staged a sit-in on the steps of Parliament House itself and re-established the embassy a second time. That standoff ended only when Whitlam agreed to personally meet with the protesters. In May of 1974, a storm tore the embassy apart entirely, but the Department of the Capital Territory, in an unusual show of cooperation, kept its contents safe in storage, rather than simply discarding them. By October that year, a group called the Organisation of Aboriginal Unity had rebuilt it, staging fresh site-ins at the Department of Aboriginal Affairs and briefly renaming the site the Canberra Aboriginal Reserve. In February of 1975, activist Charles Perkins negotiated what was billed as a temporary removal of the embassy, on the understanding that the government was finally moving toward real land rights legislation. That promise was at least partly kept. The Aboriginal Land Rights Act for the Northern Territory passed in 1976, the same piece of legislation that had grown directly out of the Wave Hill dispute we've already covered on this show. For the next 16 years, the embassy's exact form and location shifted repeatedly around Canberra, briefly operating out of a house in the suburb of Red Hill, and for a short period in 1979, reappearing on Capitol Hill itself, the site where the new Parliament House would eventually be built, under the name the National Aboriginal Government. It wasn't until the 26th of January, 1992, exactly 20 years after the original beach umbrella, that the embassy was re-established on its original site, opposite what was now called Old Parliament House, and this time it stayed. In 1995, the site was added to the Australian Register of the National Estate, formal recognition as the only nationally listed site representing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander political struggle anywhere in the country. In 2015, it was further protected under the Commonwealth Heritage List as part of the broader Old Parliament House precinct, an officially heritage-listed protest site, a strange and fairly unique status for what started as a single beach umbrella. The embassy's continued presence has kept generating exactly the kind of friction it was built to create. In January of 2012, marking the 40th anniversary, with a 3-day corroboree for sovereignty that drew thousands of Indigenous Australians to Canberra, the embassy found itself at the centre of a genuinely chaotic news cycle. Opposition leader Tony Abbott, asked that morning whether the embassy was still relevant, replied that he thought it was probably time to move on from it, since he believed a great deal had changed for the better in the decades since 1972. A union official at the embassy's anniversary event received a message, relayed through a staffer in the Prime Minister's own office, suggesting Abbott had actually said the embassy should be torn down outright, considerably stronger and more provocative than what he'd actually said. She passed that garbled version onto the crowd. When Abbott and Prime Minister Julia Gillard turned up nearby that afternoon for an awards ceremony at the lobby restaurant, presenting medals to emergency services workers, around 100 protesters surrounded the building. Both leaders had to be hurriedly escorted out by security under police protection, an evacuation so rushed and chaotic that Gillard stumbled and lost one of her shoes in the scramble, an image that made headlines well beyond Australia, in newspapers that had likely never previously run a single story about the Tent Embassy at all. The embassy's own social media account briefly suggested the shoe would only be returned in exchange for stolen land before it was handed back through more conventional channels. A subsequent investigation by the Australian Federal Police looked into whether the relayed message had amounted to criminal incitement, an inquiry that dragged the embassy, once again, into exactly the kind of national headline cycle it had first generated back in 1972, for reasons that had very little to do with its actual unresolved demands. More recently, the site's history has taken a darker, considerably less coherent turn. In December of 2021 and January of 2022, a separate group describing themselves as sovereign citizens, mixed in with anti-vaccination protesters, staged their own demonstrations near the embassy and set fire to a door of Old Parliament House, causing more than $4 million in damage to a building that, by then, operated as the Museum of Australian Democracy. Ngunnawal elder Auntie Matilda House Williams, who had been present at the embassy's founding back in 1972, publicly condemned the fire, making clear it had nothing to do with the embassy or with the Aboriginal community of Canberra itself, a deliberate, unrelated act being carried out in the shadow of a 50-year-old protest it didn't represent. On the 26th of January, 2022, the embassy marked its 50th anniversary, officially recognized by that point as the longest continuous site of protest for Indigenous land rights anywhere in the world. Organizers described the milestone not as a celebration of victory, since most of the original 1972 demands, full state-level Aboriginal control of the Northern Territory among them, remain entirely unmet, but as an opportunity to mourn what had been lost, recognize survival, and plan for whatever the next 50 years might require. So that's where we'll leave it, for this one. 4 men and a beach umbrella, on a patch of grass outside Parliament House, responding to a government announcement that offered 50-year leases instead of land. A list of demands from 1972 that, more than 50 years on, has still mostly gone unanswered. Police clashes, court rulings, a storm, multiple evictions, and at least one genuinely chaotic afternoon involving a Prime Minister's lost shoe. A heritage listing for a protest site that the government spent its first 2 decades actively trying to tear down. And a beach umbrella that turned into the longest-running political protest on the planet, sitting on the exact same lawn more than 50 years later, still waiting for an answer. There's something worth sitting with in just how long 50 years actually is, set against how little of the original 1972 demand list has actually been met. Aboriginal control of the Northern Territory as its own state never happened. Compensation anywhere near $6 billion never arrived. What did happen, slowly and unevenly, land rights legislation, native title, a scattering of heritage protections, mostly arrived because successive governments needed some way to make the embassy, and everything it represented, go away, rather than because anyone in power woke up one day and decided Aboriginal people were simply owed it. The embassy's own organisers have always understood that distinction clearly, which is part of why, 50 years on, nobody connected to it is describing this as a finished fight. If something in this one is sitting with you, let it sit for a minute before you reach for the next distraction. That discomfort is doing something useful. Thanks for listening to Truth Be Told. This has been a Three Brothers production. I'll see you next time.